Good morning. You're very welcome to the Malting Barley webinar. Malting barley has been a feature of the Irish landscape but continues to be a challenge to grow each year. Different years throw different challenges, whether it's later planting, drought, or wet harvest. The industry has to cope. Although farmers are coping with these weather events, they're also incorporating new technologies into their businesses to help achieve malting barley specs and increase financial margins. And today we'll look at some of these newer technologies. The first section of the webinar is around agronomy, and the second part looking at a malting barley grower in the UK and getting an update from the Teagasc Boortmalt joint program activities, and finally changes around your interaction with Boortmalt this year. In the first section, we will hear from Don Summers, a farmer in the southeast, and he's agronomist, who are using liquid nitrogen on his malting barley. Then Dr. Richie Hackett from Teagasc Oak Park will look at the science underpinning using liquid nitrogen. We will then have a look at cover crops from various different contributors, including David Walsh-Kemmis, a farmer from Kildare who looks at cover crops from planting to destruction. And finally in this segment, Deirdre Doyle from Teagasc and Oak Park brings us through how to cope with the loss of Chlorothalonil or Bravo this year. All of these segments from around the country will run together, and then we will take questions through the Q&A session. So as the presentations are running, type in your questions and we will ask the panel. So for now, I'll hand you over to Eoin Lyons, the Teagasc Boortmalt Joint Programme Advisor. Over to you, Eoin.
The use of liquid nitrogen has increased in popularity over the past number of years, and in this video we travelled to County Wexford to meet with tillage farmer Don Summers, who has been using liquid nitrogen on some of his crops for the past few years. The first question I put to Don was why he decided to look into the area of liquid nitrogen and what costs are involved in entering the system.
The main reason I wanted to try liquid nitrogen was to use nitrogen more accurately, maybe have better uptake of nitrogen in the crop and more accurate placement of the nitrogen in the field on headlands and on overlaps. The cost of the sprayer was very small. It was approximately €5 per nozzle for nozzles. So on a 24-metre sprayer it cost approximately €240 to fit the nozzles to the sprayer. There would be a bigger cost if you had to fit a tank to store it, and unless you commit to using a lot of it you will pay that cost, whereas if you commit to using a lot of the liquid nitrogen the supplier will rebate you the cost of the tank. But just to use it on a smaller level and not have your own supply in your yard, the costs are very small.
In 2019, Don decided to complete an on-farm trial to examine the performance of liquid nitrogen versus granular nitrogen on his spring malted barley crop in relation to both crop yield and grain protein. Don's Boortmalt agronomist at the time, Eoin MacDonald, will now explain what was involved with the trial.
Don approached me just about doing a little bit of a trial on malting barley and liquid nitrogen, and I suppose Don was just looking to see where he could fit it into what he's doing. So we kind of set up an in-field tramline trial, basically just looking at the various amounts of nitrogen and also the timings. So we went with kind of 105 units of nitrogen and then a higher amount of 117 units of nitrogen, both in granular and in liquid form, and then just the different timings of application. So we had one application of both granular and liquid at sowing, and then we had another two then where we put it out at tramlines visible, and it also came back 14 days later, so it was roughly kind of a tillering stage, just to see the various effects. So I suppose in terms of conclusion, as regards protein, there wasn't a massive amount of a difference. You're talking 0.2 or 3%. I suppose what we did see is when you step up to the 117 units of nitrogen, your protein will increase slightly, and naturally when you come back to the 105, we got kind of more distilling type spec malting barley off the lower nitrogen. And I suppose just a small point to note is, the trial was done in 2019, where it was a reasonably favourable springtime, and I suppose where the liquid probably fits in is around that the weather is dry, it's going to be hard to get granular nitrogen to wash in, and I suppose that's where we'd see it fitting into a space.
There are, of course, certain advantages and disadvantages to using liquid nitrogen, and Don will now discuss some of these in relation to his experience on his farm.
The main advantages I would see are you're not dependent on rain potentially coming after you've applied it, so you can go in and make your timings better. Another advantage is if it's a windy day, you're not going to be worried about the spread pattern. Another advantage would be there's no risk of applying any nitrogen to your hedgerows or areas where you don't want it. It's much more accurate wherever the boom covers, you put it out, and with section control on your sprayer you can apply it much more accurately on overlaps than with a fertilizer spreader. Main disadvantages would be, I suppose the first one is the logistics of it. If you don't have a local supplier, and I'm lucky in that my local supplier, John Cullen Grain, has a supply of it there if I want it, or I can also use granular if the weather suits to use that. So if that would be a big disadvantage. Another disadvantage would be there's the potential to scorch a crop if you go in at the wrong time. Say if a crop is drying and you apply it, you could potentially scorch a crop. I suppose just the handling of it, you could potentially have a bigger risk of corrosion on your sprayer than with granular fertilizer on a fertilizer spreader, so you have to be a bit more careful about washing down the machine after use and things like that.
Final question I put to Don was what plans he has for the future in relation to using liquid nitrogen on his crops, and will he continue to use liquid nitrogen going forward?
Well, I'll continue to use it where it's appropriate. If it's a year like 2020 where we had a prolonged dry spell at the tillering stage, I opted to use the liquid nitrogen at tillering stage at a small rate rather than granular because I felt there wasn't sufficient rain coming. I would also see myself using it in the likes of oilseed rape or winter wheat, where you're going with the late application of a tall crop and it's not practical to lift the fertilizer spreader high enough over the crop to get an even application. But again, I'm lucky in that I have a supply local to me where I don't need to invest in a tank, and I can make a decision in a given season which is most appropriate for that year for the given crop.
Okay, so good morning. So today I'm going to talk about liquid N as a fertilizer for barley. And I suppose just in terms of outline, I'm going to do a quick little bit of introduction, some advantages and disadvantages of the product, and then some of our research results from recent years, and then just sum up with a quick conclusion. So I suppose, first of all, liquid N, what is it? Well, I suppose it's also known as UAN, which stands for urea ammonium nitrate, and that more or less tells us what it is. It's a mixture of urea and ammonium nitrate in solution. So 50% of the nitrogen in the product is as urea, and 25% is as ammonium nitrate, nitrogen, and 25% is as nitrate, nitrogen. And I suppose while it's a solution, many people might think it's a foliar fertilizer, but it's not a foliar fertilizer. It's a soil-acting fertilizer, and it's quite different from the fertilizers that people might put in their normal sprayer as a mix, or maybe people might have used foliar urea in the past, where the objective is to get the product in through the leaf. But with liquid N, the objective is to get the product into the soil, and the plant gets it from the soil. And that has implications for its application. So you need large droplets that will bounce off leaves rather than being absorbed by the leaf. And so you're not spraying with your standard spraying nozzles. There's special nozzles for applying liquid N, and these are sometimes called streamer nozzles, or also streamer bars. And this is just an example of those two types of nozzles. On the left, you have the streamer bar, where the material falls directly down from the bar, and these are quite height independent. It doesn't matter what height above the crop you're spraying at. On the right hand side, you have some of the nozzles. In this case, it's a 7 jet nozzle. There's also three jet nozzles and 5 jet nozzles. These tend to be a little bit more height sensitive. If they're too high or too low, the spread pattern can be affected to some extent with some of them, not all of them. In terms of advantages, well, Don has just given you a lot of the advantages. So I suppose one is evenness of application, especially if you're on wide tram lines or if you're applying in less than favourable conditions, such as windy conditions. So it can be quite good in that sense because you're applying with a sprayer and you're not relying on throwing a granule, 12 or 24 meters or whatever the tram width that you're using. I suppose there's also potentially less overlaps on ins and outs, given that you're using a sprayer rather than trying to gauge where to turn on the fertilizer spreader. But I suppose the one point I would make is it sort of depends on how accurate your tram widths are. If you're spraying with a 24-meter tram and your trams are only 23.5 meters or maybe 23 meters, and you're using liquid nitrogen, that you will have a half meter or a meter of an overlap, which will be getting double the rate, and that will show up quite quickly in terms of lodging later in the season. There can be a small cost per kilo of nitrogen advantage. I have a question mark there because it varies and it depends on what price you compare. And at the moment, we obviously know that the fertilizer market is changing quite quickly, and so it's difficult to get definite prices. But there's, as well as the direct cost of the nitrogen, there's also other costs in terms of storage costs, which can add to the overall cost. Disadvantages, I suppose one of the main disadvantages is that, as I said, 50% of the nitrogen is present as urea, and as we know, urea nitrogen can be lost as ammonia to the atmosphere. And that's an issue with liquid nitrogen just as much as it is with granular nitrogen, and maybe even more so in some instances. This can be minimized by including a urease inhibitor, which is essentially protects the urea as for protected granular urea. But that's not all that common of the liquid end products that are available in Ireland at the moment. There is some potential for crop scorch, particularly if you apply it to more advanced crops. That can be an issue. It's not a major issue, but it is a risk. If you need on-farm storage, it adds a bit to the cost of the overall system. And I suppose, like any other fertilizer, it can cause corrosion, and corrosion is probably something that you need to be careful of when you're using this with your sprayer. You're maybe used to having corrosion on your fertilizer spreader, but on a sprayer it can be something that you're not used to. So careful cleaning of the equipment after using liquid N is recommended. I suppose just to look at some figures in terms of N loss as ammonia. This is some work from the UK where they looked at using different fertilizers on, in this case it was winter cereals. So they had urea, they had ammonium nitrate, which is equivalent to CAN, and they had liquid N, and they had liquid N with NBPT, which is the urease inhibitor, which is that protects the urea within the product. And you can see in terms of the loss, quite high losses from urea, the ammonium nitrate quite low losses, and the liquid N is roughly in the middle of the two. The liquid N without a protector is roughly in the middle of the two, and then the liquid N with the protection is reasonably close to the ammonium nitrate. So N can be lost from the product. It won't always be lost in every situation, but there is that risk. Is liquid N better in dry conditions? I don't have a definite answer for this, but I suppose if we think about the amount of liquid being applied is very small. 1 millimeter of rain is equivalent to about 10,000 litres per hectare. If you're putting on, say, 200 litres a hectare of liquid N, which is a reasonably good rate of nitrogen, it's only equivalent to about a fraction of a millimeter of rain. So that's unlikely to get nitrogen into the soil. Typically, for granular products, we would say you need 10 to 15 millimeters of rain to get the fertilizer well washed in. So because if it's near the surface and it's urea and it's already dissolved, the loss can start soon after application. And I suppose when we look at results from abroad in terms of performance, the performance of UAN is usually between that of urea and CAN. And if in situations where there's no loss of N from the UAN, it will be similar to that of CAN. Some work from our trials the last couple of years in terms of winter wheat. This is a trial where we compared urea, liquid N and CAN at a range of different rates. So what What we can see here is particularly if we concentrate on the lower rates of nitrogen, which is where you will generally see differences between fertilizer types. We can see that the urea is lower, which is the red bar, is lower, and the liquid N is a little bit higher than the urea, and then the CAN in terms of yield was the better of the products at the lower end, where the nitrogen is most required, or going to be most in deficit, if you like. We also measure the amount of nitrogen taken into the grain in terms of kilos per hectare, and again we can see the same trend. CAN had the highest amount of nitrogen being taken into the grain, which is a function of its yield and the protein content. Urea is much lower, and then the UEN is in the liquid N is in the middle. We also did some work on spring barley, and this was again where we compared CAN and UAN, and we measured yield, and we found no particular difference in this particular trial. And when we looked at protein, so much as the same as Don found in his trial, we found no difference either. Again, this is only one site in one season. As for the wheat, it's only a single site, single season. And I'm not trying to say either that UEN works better on one crop or the other. These are just two example trials that we had data from. It's something we're looking at going forward. So in conclusion then, liquid N can give more precise application. The performance of liquid N can be similar to CAN, but there is a risk of N loss with liquid N, and if you do lose N, it's going to reduce your performance. And it does offer some logistical advantages in terms of spreadability on headlands and such and so forth.
The agriculture catchments programme was set up in 2008 to monitor and evaluate Ireland's requirements under the EU Nitrates Directive and the Water Framework Directive. And they were also given the remit of providing measurements on the efficacy of the nitrates derogation. We're currently in the 4th phase of the programme, and each phase is 4 years long. This is the 2nd year of phase 4, which has seen us take on the added measure of measuring greenhouse gas emissions. So currently today we're standing in the Castledockrell catchment in County Wexford. This is predominantly a tillage catchment, with over 2/3 of the area being in tillage production, and of that almost 3/4 of that tillage production is spring barley, with most farmers having a contract with Boortmalt to supply malt and barley. And the reason for the tillage being predominant in this catchment is because of the soil. And the soil here is a light free draining soil, which mostly belongs to the Clonroach series. It's very light, as I said, and I suppose the main nutrient then at risk of being lost to water is nitrogen. With spring barley being the predominant crop grown in this catchment, it leaves the soil very much open for long periods of the year. After harvest in August or September, in a lot of cases, you're going to be left with stubble ground between then and ploughing the next spring. So recently, with the gloss scheme introduction, a lot of farmers in this catchment were given the opportunity to sow catch crops, which left them then with the chance to receive a nominal fee of €155 per hectare to sow catch crops. And this meant then that there was a green cover crop on the stubble ground over winter, and this has reduced the risk of nutrient runoff and leaching over the winter period, especially with nitrogen being a problem here in this catchment. The green cover has helped where nitrogen release has occurred over winter. The crop has been able to take up most of this nitrogen, and it has reduced the risk then of losses to water. With the catchments programme, we have seen from the use of catch crops in the area, we have high resolution water quality monitoring stations in each catchment, and This equipment takes measurements on different parameters every 10 minutes, every day, all year round. Some of these measurements include the nitrogen and phosphorus fractions within the water, water temperature, conductivity, turbidity, and other factors. And these data have provided us with a lot of scientific information, which has allowed us to measure how much nutrients have been lost, especially in periods of high rainfall. And from what we have seen with the results of the programme, we've seen that catch crops have had a benefit in terms of reduced nutrient losses in high rainfall periods, especially during the winter. So we can only see benefits coming from catch crops being sown in this catchment, and hopefully once the GLOS programme ends, farmers will continue to grow catch crops to avoid or reduce the nutrient losses to water.
So we're here today to discuss the impacts of cover crops over a number of years on a given site on the soil health or the soil quality. So the impacts are threefold really. The first is the impact of the canopy itself. By growing to this height, it is creating a shelter or an umbrella for the soil, and that is removing the impact of rain beating off the soil over the winter. When rain hits bare soil, it dislodges soil particles, which are then free to either move through the soil pores blocking them, or run off the soil surface carrying nutrients into watercourses. The second impact is the roots themselves. They grow through the soil and they break up this compaction that may have happened over the given growing season. They exude substances from their roots, which create a feed source for soil macro and microorganisms, thus improving soil biology. And all of this activity together causes the soil to create this lovely crumb structure. These small soil peds or crumbs or aggregates basically will hold the soil water going forward, and the spaces beneath them will create the pore space in which air can be carried, and that creates the perfect growing conditions for your crop. And finally, the third benefit. When we finally incorporate this crop back into the soil, the breakdown of the material adds to the soil organic matter, amplifying soil carbon and sequestering it, and providing a feed source again for soil macro and microorganisms, which are all going to improve soil quality and soil health. We're now going to move to another site where catch crops have been grown over a number of years, but unfortunately due to the harvesting conditions this year, they were sown about a month after this crop. So we're now standing in another field of catch crops that was sown nearly a month later. This is Phacelia and Vetch, and as you can see, it's a very different field. And if we look at the topsoil here, it's a lot denser than what we saw in the previous field. It's not bad now, but obviously the roots haven't penetrated as much and given us all those advantages that we discussed.
So this is our field, one of our fields of cover crops that we have here on the farm. We started sort of putting in cover crops about 6 or 7 years ago, so it was before the GLOS scheme came in, and we tried various different options. Probably the most successful in terms of the establishment was anything that had a brassica in it, and particularly then when we were trying to graze them, we found that those were the most palatable as well, so that was the easiest way of dealing with the crops afterwards. Anything that's in a GLOS field, we will put in the GLOS mix, so that's fodder, rape and turnip. And really what we're trying to do is just get a crop in as quickly as possible after the spring barley comes out. The one problem we sometimes get caught with is the straw. So what we tried to do was to chop the straw and then put the cover crop in afterwards, but we found the establishment of the cover crop was a bit difficult if there was chopped straw all over the field. So what we will do now is bale it and remove it, and then the difficulty then is if you're getting wet straw and you're trying to get it off the field, the date can get pushed back. But ideally, if we're cutting spring barley on the 10th of August, we'd like to be in within a week and get the cover crop in, because the earlier we can get it in, the much more success we have in terms of getting it established. We do a very simple establishment method, so we go out with a disc, we cut up the soil to a depth of only maybe a centimetre, a couple of centimetres, then we go in with a fertiliser spreader, because we found the calibration in the fertiliser spreader was easier than anything else we were using, and then we just come out and roll it afterwards. So it's a very sort of cheap and cheerful way of getting it in, but so long as the seeds can get any sort of bit of soil around them, and then, as I said, if we don't have the chopped straw, we found we didn't have a slug problem, so that they were establishing and getting away, and then once they get to 3 or 4 leaves, they're fine and they'll generally take off pretty well from there. In terms of management, after the crop has come up, once we get to the 1st of December, then we will generally try and graze the crops down. It just means that when we're ploughing back in the following spring, we don't have a big mass of cover crop there to deal with, and then we're getting the benefit of getting extra organic matter in as well. And one thing this farm is struggling on is organic matter and a bit of nutrient in the soils.
A question that I often get asked in relation to catch crops in malt and barley is how much nitrogen the catch crop has firstly taken up and how much it will release back to the following spring malt and barley crop. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to answer this question, as nitrogen within the soil can be extremely variable. Therefore, it is difficult to quantify how much nitrogen that catch crop has taken from the soil and how much it will release when it is desiccated. The most effective way of determining whether or not there is a high level of nitrogen within the catch crop before the spring malt and barley is drilled is to firstly examine the crop that is in front of you within the field. If the crop has large amount of growth, there is a good possibility that excess nitrogen will be released to the following crop. If there was small levels of growth in the catch crop, this means that there was a low level of residual nitrogen within the field, and therefore there would be a low chance of nitrogen being released back to the following malt and barley crop. Having determined that we have a large cover crop within our field, we then must examine the plants within the cover crop more carefully. If the plants are leafy in nature with little stem, this would indicate that there will be a high level of nitrogen possibly released to the following malt and barley crop, and the release of nitrogen will happen quite quickly after desiccation of the cover crop. If the crop is quite stemmy in nature with little leaf, this would indicate that nitrogen release will be slower compared to a leafy crop, and there is less likely chance of nitrogen being released to the following malt and barley crop. The third scenario is where the catch crop has been grazed by livestock. In a situation like this, there's a very high probability that nitrogen will be made available to the following spring malt and barley crop. In these situations, nitrogen rate must be reduced, and also barley that is destined for distilling grade should be avoided being sown in these fields.
Having seen the 3 different possible catch crop scenarios, we must now determine what reduction in nitrogen rate will be required for the following crop. On leafy crops, reduce nitrogen rate by 10 kg a hectare from your normal nitrogen application rate on the farm, while for grazed catch crops, reduce by 10 to 15 kg a hectare.
In summary, it is possible that nitrogen within the soil can be taken up by the catch crop and released back to the following spring malt and barley crop. However, it is very difficult to accurately determine this. The best course of action is to follow the guidelines set out as part of the video to firstly examine the catch crop and then, based on the assessment, reduce nitrogen rate accordingly.
Okay, so I am going to talk about Ramularia and some of the work that we have carried out over the last couple of years looking at alternatives to chlorothalonil for the control of Ramularia in barley crops. So to start, what is Ramularia? So Ramularia is a disease that attacks barley late in the season, and stress crops are more likely to show symptoms. And unfortunately, once symptoms develop on the upper leaves post-flowering, treatment is not effective. The yield loss from Ramularia relates directly to the loss of the photosynthetic area, and losses of up to 1 tonne per hectare have been reported. So this is the Ramularia life cycle. So from what we understand, Ramularia can come into a crop from a number of different sources. Some Ramularia may come from infected seed and be carried throughout the plant that way, whereas some may come from airborne spores from cereal hosts and debris. So the symptoms generally develop on the upper leaves later on in the plant life cycle after comes under stress, so generally after flowering, and the symptoms can then progress onto the ears and the awns, further reducing the amount of green leaf area available for photosynthetic ability. So these are just a few pictures showing the development of Ramularia over the last 20 years. So it's just showing how Ramularia has developed into quite a major disease which can severely affect yield, particularly now since we have lost Chlorothalonil for the control of Ramularia, which did a really, really good job controlling the disease up until now. So this leads us into understanding why Ramularia is important to yield. So in order to maximize barley yields, you need to both create and protect your plants for maximum yield. So by creating yield, you need to ensure high tiller numbers, and this means that some early disease control may be required to protect these tillers. And then in order to move on to protecting your crop, this means ensuring that once tillers and ears have established into mature plants, that these grains are then filled. However, the program that you use to protect the canopy doesn't need to keep the plants fully green to the very end. And then just on the right here is a graph showing some of the work that we have done on spring barley timings over a number of years. Just to reiterate the points I was saying, so the most important timings that we use are mid to late tillering, so to help protect your early tillers, and then to apply your second fungicide at growth stage 39 to 49 when your awns are peeping to protect the upper canopy. So these graphs here show the impact Ramularia can have on yield depends on the year and the amount of pressure that you get from Ramularia. So the graph on the left is results from a trial from 2016, shows that the amount of disease that came in was relatively low, and it also came in late in the crop, so it didn't have much effect on the final yield. However, the graph on the right hand side is from the same trial from 2017, where we got similar levels of disease, possibly a little bit higher, but they came in earlier, and so they were there for longer, which reduced the amount of green leaf area available for photosynthesis for grain fill. So this did have more of an effect on final grain yield. So how will we manage Ramularia in 2021? So some of the questions that we have been looking at are, what is the current resistance status of the SDHIs and the azoles, and how widespread is the resistance? The inclusion of Revistar in programs, and looking at Folpit and other multi-sites as alternatives to chlorothalonil for Ramularia control. So to try answer some of these questions, one of the trials we carried out on spring barley was a trial that we carried out in 2019. This was carried out at 2 sites, in Oak Park in Carlow and in Kildalton, and the variety we used was Planet. This trial got a cover spray of a half rate of proline and a half rate of modem at late tillering to protect early tillers, and then there was a range of different products applied to test Ramularia control at growth stage 49. So on the graph here, you can see that chlorothalonil was used as the base treatment to compare all the rest to, and you can see that it gave the highest level of control. It was closely followed by proline and propulse, which gave good levels of control, and following this were the different multi-sites that we used, which are Mancozeb and Folpit. While they didn't give quite the same level of control as chlorothalonil, they were still giving quite a decent level of control there. And then you can also see there's results there from Modem Imtrex, so your strobilurin and your SDHI. Due to resistance issues with both of these actives, the level of control there was quite low. But then you can just also see on the left hand side of the graph the cover spray, which was applied on its own. Again, while not giving near as much control as chlorothalonil, did give some control compared to the untreated, so it was doing something there. And then this is the same trial that we carried out in 2020. However, we only have results from 1 site from Kildalton, as we didn't get any Ramularia in Oak Park last year. So again, chlorothalonil was the base treatment. It gave really good levels of control, which was very comparable to Revistar, which was included in the program in 2020. Unfortunately, the multi-sites, both Folpit and Mancozeb, and then your different azoles, proline and propulse, while they gave some level of control, was quite poor in comparison to chlorothalonil, and compared quite similarly to Imtrex and Modem there, which gave low levels of control. And again, the cover spray did give some level of control by just being applied on its own. And also just say the untreated was excluded from this graph as it had senesced at the time of assessment. So when it comes to building programs in spring barley, you generally look at how does your typical fungicide program stack up, and do alternative multi-sites have a role in the program? So in order to look at to try answer some of these questions, we did a trial on spring barley in 2019 at 2 sites. So here in Oak Park and also in Wexford, we used 3 different malting varieties, Perpino, Planet and Laureate, and compared 3 different multi-sites along with a base program to see how well they controlled Ramularia. So the results from that trial are here. So you can see that the base program itself, which was Siltra applied at 0.5 litres per hectare at late tillering, followed by Syriax at 1.5 litres per hectare at growth stage 49, so when the awns were peeping. That base program itself, it gave a very good level of control compared to the untreated. However, when we added in the multi-sites, so there was Chlorothalonil, Folpit and Mancozeb, you can see that they gave a further significant level of control of Ramularia in the trial. And interestingly, to see that there is no significant difference between the different types of multi-sites that we use. Also, just to say that while we use Mancozeb in these trials as an alternative, we use Mancozeb as an alternative multi-site, this can't be used anymore. Okay, so when it comes to controlling Ramularia in 2021, while it is very important to know the disease resistance ratings of the variety that you're going to grow, unfortunately, we can't rely on varietal resistance when it comes to Ramularia. So this is where agronomic practices come into play. So trying not to stress the crop as much as possible. I mean, in an Irish climate, this can be difficult, particularly with the amount of, the type of weather we get and the amount of rain we get. So by providing adequate nutrition to minimize stress on the crop, and then building your fungicide program to protect the crop as best as possible, by using a mixture of actives and including a multi-site at your on emerging spray to try to reduce the amount of disease that affects the crop. Thank you.
Okay, Deirdre, thank you very much for that presentation, and for everybody else, there's a huge amount of information there. So we're now in the questions and answers section. I'd like to welcome our panel here. So we've Eoin Lyons back again, Dr. Richie Hackett, Deirdre, you're with us as well, and Tom Bryan from Boortmalt. So we're going to go through the questions. There's a lot of questions after coming in, so we're going to do our best to answer as many as we can live in the short section, and those that we can't, we'll try and type in some answers for you as well. So Deirdre, I would like to come to you first, maybe ask you the first question. So it's a question around stresses, and we've had a lot of rainfall. Fields are at soil capacity in terms of water. Is that enough stress, or what other stresses are out there that would induce Ramularia later in the season?
Okay, thank you, Michael. So there are a number of different stresses that are likely to exacerbate the amount of Ramularia that can come into your barley crop. So, so to start with weather, so like you're saying, yes, there's a lot of rain out there. Particularly if you get a lot of rainfall, and particularly if this happens kind of around the flowering stage, this is likely to exacerbate stress onto the crop, and then this may lead to the development of Ramularia symptoms. And then just flowering alone itself is also a stress on the crop. But then when it comes to things that we can actually kind of control ourselves apart from the weather, things like complicated tank mixes, so not to add in too many actives into your tank at the one time, because it'll heat up the mix too much and can add quite a lot of stress to your plant there. And then also trying to control any other diseases that might come into the plant. So even earlier on, like I was saying, protecting your early tillers. It's like if you have the likes of Rinco or net blotch coming in there, just to make sure you're using a good fungicide program there that will help to control all these diseases, to then just reduce stress on the plant throughout throughout the growing season of the plant.
Okay, so it's pretty liable to stress, is basically what you're saying. There's all sorts of things going to do it. Deirdre, just a follow-up one there, just in terms of, do you know the percentage of seed that's out there that is already infected with Ramularia?
I don't know exactly how much is infected. We just know that there is a certain amount of it that can be infected, and that's where some of the Ramularia can come through into the crops. Okay,
I think just in the background, I think there's a good bit of it actually is infected from year to year. Okay, Richie, I'm just going to come across to you for a second. Richie, can you include sulfur with UAN?
Yes, so there's a number of formulations that come with sulfur included. So I was speaking mainly about the pure UAN, but there are versions with sulfur as well. So you just ask your merchant and they will supply that for you.
Okay, and Richie, I also want to ask one, there's a good few questions around UAN and the losses in terms of the environmental losses, and maybe you might expand a little bit on this, but there's a question we'll just start off with. It is, so when UAN gets into the soil, how long does it take before it's stable and before those losses are reduced?
It depends on what you mean by get into the soil. So if it's just sprayed on, it's probably not going to get into the soil very much, and it's still going to be at risk. But if it gets rain, like any fertilizer, and it's washed a little bit deeper into the soil, it'll be the same as any other fertilizer. In terms of how quickly it becomes available to the crop, urea breaks down quite quickly. It's a matter of days after it's applied to the soil once the urea enzymes gets to work on it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come across to you, Eoin. There's a good few questions in here around cover crops, and there's one in here for a long continuous cereal site there for the last 15 or 20 years. Does the establishment of a cover crop on that kind of soil, is it necessary to have nitrogen going in to establish that crop, or is there enough nitrogen already in the soil?
Well, it depends on the crop offtakes from the previous crop, the previous spring barley crop or winter barley. Look, if it's a poor crop beforehand, you would imagine that enough nitrogen is already in the soil to allow the crop to grow. If a large previous crop has come off, look, there should still be enough nitrogen, but if you have plans to graze the cash crop, maybe some nitrogen might have to be added.
Okay, and Eoin, I think you might have mentioned this already maybe in the video, but a question in here, where does, or at what timing does catch crops release that nitrogen back to the next crop?
Yeah, so it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the nitrogen will be released from the catch crop back to the malting barley crop. But I suppose, as I said in the video, the guidelines will be just to assess the catch crop and see if it's stemmy or leafy. And I suppose after the catch crop naturally dies or dies by an application of glyphosate, the nitrogen will be released back if it's stemmy quite slowly, if it's a leafy crop, maybe quite quickly.
Okay. Richie, I'm just going to go back to you for a second. There's a question here that around John Spink mentioned at the tillage conference last year that there was no need to worry about I suppose gaseous emissions from fertilizers from the products we use, and not to worry about using urea inhibitors in tillage. You might maybe expand, and I know you mentioned this in your presentation, you might expand just a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, I suppose what John was comparing was the issue with grassland versus tillage and use of CAN versus urea. So there's no great advantage to switching from CAN to protected urea in tillage, whereas there is in grassland, because greenhouse gases emissions are lower in tillage to start with. But if you are going to use urea, so if you do decide to use urea, you are at risk of losing ammonia, which isn't really a greenhouse gas. And in that case, it would be advised to use protection to prevent that ammonia loss, which is basically nitrogen loss, irrespective of whether you're using granular or liquid fertilizer. That's more if you do decide to use urea. But as John's point would have been, there's no great advantage to switching from an environmental point of view from switching from CAN to urea in tillage.
Okay. Deirdre, I'm just going to come back to you maybe for the final question in this particular segment. There's a question in here about what rate of Folpet or Mancozeb were used in the programs that you put on. And you might maybe also just comment about whether it should be 1 Folpet or 2 Folpets in a spring barley application. What's the ideal?
Yeah, sure. So we used 1.5 litres of Folpet and 2 kilos of Mancozeb. So we used half rates there in our trial. So something similar to what you would use if you were applying Chlorothalonil. As regards applying Folpet twice in the trial, we didn't do that in the trial, so we don't actually have any results from that as such. But from the results that we got of including the Folpet with the program, you can see that it gave very, very good levels of control there. So it gave sufficient control there by just applying it once at the on-emergent spray. So applying it twice probably wouldn't have been necessary.
Okay, thanks very much, Deirdre, and thanks very much to everyone on the panel. We're just up against it a little bit in terms of time, so thanks very much for the answers so far. And look, we're going to return back again to the questions and answers after the next segment. So keep your questions and answers coming, or questions coming, I should say. So in the next segment, we're going to go across and hear from Craig Livingston from Loughery Estate in the UK, who will give us an insight into growing malt and barley on the estate on their farm. And then we'll go across and listen to some of the program of activities that were happening on the Boortmalt joint program in 2020, and also what's coming up in 2021. And then finally, we will hear from Max Potterton from Boortmalt, who will outline some of the changes around, the interactions you're going to have with Boortmalt this year. So I'm going to hand you across to Eoin, who's chatting with Craig in the UK.
And I suppose firstly, I just want to ask just to give an overview of the farm and location.
So there's two farms primarily. We'll talk about locally today, but the business is made up of two farms. In total, we farm just over 1,300 hectares of arable land, and then there's an additional whatever there is, 300 hectares of woodland, and fairly ambitious stewardship schemes with higher tier options and livestock and bits and bobs. So it's quite diverse. This local estate, this side of the business is based over outside Stockbridge, which is pretty much between Winchester and Salisbury. We've got 11 different soil types on this farm, from the lightest chalk to the sort of heaviest clay, and yeah, gives us plenty of challenges. Malting barley's got a great part in our rotation for the type of system we farm. We would like to think we fit in that sort of regenerative farming model, which I know has all become a bit fashionable and things, but it's certainly the way we farm for the last 5 or so years, since I came here from an ex-agronomy job. So the best soil for us that fits probably a third of this farm is the nice light chalk. It's nice light, 40 centimetres depth to chalk. It's quick to warm up in the spring. It holds moisture. It lets crops tiller. We can drill early. So it's perfect, and that's what if I wanted to be a top quality malting barley farmer, I'd buy a farm on the chalk. We try and control the 10% of things we do control, sort of like military. You know, we've certainly complicated our system by no stubble is left uncovered over winter, so we introduce cover crops the whole system. We then have 1,000 sheep that run the cover crops, so we introduce a kind of natural cycle of nitrogen into that system. We've moved to certainly a far more reduced tillage. We're not zero till, as much as our brains might be 5-6 years in front of where the farm is. We're not there yet. So it's predominantly a Vadestad top-down based system, but it's far shallower than what we were working 5 years ago when I came here to Lockerbie. So we are very much a min-till farm.
But what management techniques do you put in place to try and achieve, I suppose, your desired protein grain level as regards your nitrogen input?
So we have reduced our nitrogen by just under 30%. So this year we'll be putting on probably 105 kilos of nitrogen in front of spring malting barley, whereas again traditionally any grower around here would tend to say they put on 150 kilos.
Okay. And does the sowing date have a big impact then on achieving the desired protein levels, or what would your target drilling date be?
Huge. Target drilling for me today, 15th of February. If I could drill barley today, we would. We're spraying stubbles off at the moment, and we're putting urea on seed beds, ready to be shallow cultivated in. So yeah, no, the earlier the better, assuming it's a growing, you know, we're just going into a growier spell of weather. So yeah, absolutely, it's all about tiller manipulation. You know, I want 1,000 to 1,200 ears per metre squared when I get to harvest, and I'm, you know, the yield of barley is set, as we know, right early in the season. So yeah, 375 seeds a metre squared is what we're going at, all variably drilled. So, you know, depending on chalk or clay cap.
And I suppose keeping with agronomy, how does disease have an impact on the barley crop and producing the quality that is required for malt?
Yeah, I mean, the prescriptiveness of the agronomy is key, and it's what I really thoroughly enjoy about this job is the difference and the decision making in hand. You know, we listen. We're a member of NIAB TAG, a research organisation over here, and we work with other people. But the decision rests with us. You know, our sprayer operator is basis qualified as well, and we need to take those decisions. And if we feel the disease doesn't warrant an additional spend, you know, I read things in the press last year about, you know, you must get on with your T2 on your spring barley because it protects the colour. Well, I've never sold spring barley based on colour. You know, I've got it in front of me. You know, our total crop protection pesticide spend last year was £58 a hectare. Our crop, you know, was a 6 tonne a hectare crop. Our average yield here is probably about 6.3. But last year we had one of our highest ever yielding crops, you know, just not far under 9 tonne a hectare. But our worst performing crop was 5.2. So, you know, there's no pub yields here. It's all goes across the weighbridge. I can't kid ourselves. The point of this is trying to build a resilient rotation, and it's all about net margin of the whole rotation for me. So if the crop needs it and it can justify it, we'll get it. But we're certainly not going out insurance spraying for things because we can't afford it. Part of the reason we're looking to work together is looking at the opportunities for exactly that. So we've started bringing our own milling wheat back as bags of flour. We've got venison and meat boxes on the farm. We've got vegetables and different things, trying to create our own marketplace because we can't be held apart anymore as we, you know, we have to be part of either the processing, manufacturing, distributing, where the extra margin is. We can't just be the primary producer. You know, from delinking from the BPS, we're going to have to produce more than double by 2028 than what we do today to have the same amount of income. And that's not going to come from changing a 7-ton barley crop into 14 tons. It's just not possible. So we've got to think differently. We grow Maris Otter, which is an old variety, but the reason we grow Maris Otter is it's very low input on nitrogen, slightly higher on fungicides, in fairness, but from a carbon budget, that offers us a total different approach to how we grow our crops. And for us, we're trying to create that going forward, and also have something with a Buckley Estate stamp on it. You know, we want provenance, we want a real trust in what we're producing and let people enjoy that. So
we are now in the 3rd year of the Teagasc Boortmalt joint programme, and as a part of this, I'm just going to go through the actions that we have planned for the coming season. To start, I'm going to go through the malt and barley crop trials. Firstly is the winter malt, and last October a replicated winter malt and barley trial was drilled in Teagasc Oak Park. The reason for this was because Boortmalt had the aim of increasing the area of winter malt and barley drilled over the coming years, and this trial will allow us to increase our knowledge of winter malt and barley going forward. The purpose is to firstly assess variety performance from a range of winter malt and barley varieties, and secondly as a nitrogen rate trial, so that we can have a better understanding of how much nitrogen to apply to winter malts in order to achieve the desired grain protein. The varieties included in the trial are Craft, which will be known to many growers, Electrum, which is a 2-row barley, Jayu, which is a 6-row barley, Bessel, which is 2-row, Laureate, which has been included as an autumn sown spring barley, and also a number or coded variety, which is also a 6-row. In conjunction with the replicated trials in Oak Park, we also have these varieties sown on 3 different farms in Laois, Kildare and Wexford. By having these demo plots on these farms will allow us to collect agronomy information as we go through the growing season from different areas from throughout the southeast. Moving on to spring malt, and the trials planned for this year are nitrogen rate tramline trials. Tramline trials are trials which are set up on a block basis or in a large scale on farm within fields. For these trials, the fields that will be used will be approximately 20 acres in size, and nitrogen will be applied at different rates across each tramlines, with the purpose of assessing both crop yield and protein from the different rates of nitrogen applied to each tramline. As these are large-scale trials, a plot combine will not be able to be used to record the data as regards yield from these crops. So in order to record the yield, we will use a normal combine that has both yield monitoring and yield mapping equipment. By having this, the yield from each rate of nitrogen from each tramline can be recorded and therefore assessed to give us our results. These trials will give us localized results in relation to nitrogen application rates for spring malt. It will allow us to have localized results in relation to nitrogen application for spring malt in each region throughout the southeast. Moving on from our trials, we will also have crop demos, and this will be a continuation of the demos that have been on the monitor farms for the past 2 years of the joint programme. Some of the demos that will be in place will include seedbed preparation, seeding rates, the use of plant growth regulators on malt and barley, and also Ramularia control options. Unfortunately, we would have people in to view these demos as part of our series of crop walks. Due to COVID-19, there are no crop walks planned for the immediate future. To replace these walks, we will have malt and barley video series. This will mean there'll be regular videos each 2-week period of the malt and barley growing season, where growers can see updates from the monitor farms in relation to crop progression and also in relation to our crop demos. Moving on from the actions of the joint programme, I just want to go through one part of crop advice for the coming season, and that's in relation to seeding rates. Sowing the correct number of seeds per metre squared is vital to ensure that we achieve top yields of spring malt and barley. In order to achieve this, 350 seeds per metre squared should be sown at drilling time. By sowing these 350 seeds, we will have an approximate plant establishment rate of 85%, which will give 300 plants per metre squared. By having these 300 plants, and provided there's a normal type malt and barley growing season, this will ensure good tillering of the crop and produce our target of 1,000 heads per metre squared come harvest time. Without these 1,000 heads, we will not be able to maximise the yield of the spring malt and barley crop. So ensuring the 350 seeds per metre squared are put in the seedbed at sowing time is essential. In order to ensure these seeds are placed in the seedbed, we first need to gather the 1,000 grain weight from each variety. In the box, I have listed the 3 main malt and barley varieties that will be available this year. These include Planet, Laureate, and Tungsten. Beside each variety, I've listed 1,000 grain weight. It is important to note that these are only average 1,000 grain weight figures, and they may vary depending on each seed lot that comes onto the farm. Therefore, it is vital that you inspect each seed lot that comes in and record the 1,000 grain weight from the bag. Once we have established our 1,000 grain weight of the seed, we can now input the information into the seed rate formula. The seed rate formula is the target plant population per metre squared by our 1,000 grain weight over our percentage establishment. This will give us our seeding rate in kilos per hectare. So an example of this is 300 plants, which is our target plant population per metre squared, by 52, which is an average 1,000 grain weight of Planet, over 85%. And this will give us a seeding rate of 183 kilos per hectare, and will ensure that 350 seeds are placed in the seedbed at drilling time. My last slide is just to draw growers' attention to our soil sample offer. This is the final year of the reduced rate soil sampling offer for Boortmalt growers. And eligible growers can sample every 4 hectares or 10 hectares of their malt and barley land. And they can avail of a 60% reduction in normal soil sampling costs for S1 samples, which is P, K, and pH, and S4 samples, which is P, K, pH, and micronutrients. So S1, which is usually 25, is now 10, and S4, which is usually 36, is now 20. So if a malt and barley grower requires samples, you can contact me, myself, your Teagasc advisor or Boortmalt agronomist, and make sure to do so quickly as sowing time is fast approaching and time is running out to get samples taken. Thank you.
So good morning everyone, my name is Potterton from Boortmalt, agronomist here in the Kildare area. So for 2021 we are looking at a different picture really from malting barley due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The demand for brewing malt for beer is hugely down really as a result of the hospitality closures. But the good news for the malting industry is that our distilling customers have largely been able to continue due to longer production timelines and processing timelines. So for this year there will be a larger quantity of distilling barley required. Over the last month or so, the Boortmalt Agri team have been involved in a historical exercise to determine the amount of barley distilling barley that have been supplied by 600 or 700 growers in the past 5 years. So this has been quite a big exercise, but one of the main findings is we are likely going to increase the distilling percentage to 9.7 this year. This is also due to some flexibility on behalf of our distilling customers as well as the market has grown. So with regards of achieving distilling barley, there is management practices that can be implemented. Obviously it does require some seasonal assistance as well. So the best management practice in my experience as an agronomist is a significant portion of nitrogen in the seedbed and sowing the crop as early as possible. In an ideal world, this is going to be the end of February and the first few days of March. I suppose we're looking out the window at the moment now with wet land and no cold forecast really. Thankfully there will be some drying, but that may be unlikely this year, but we never know what the end of the month could do. But I would rather sow on the early side than waiting for huge amounts of piles of dust and bone dry seed beds, as happened at the very end of March last year, which further restricted crop growth. So aim to get your crop in as early into the ground as possible. If that runs late, you should really consider putting a much larger proportion of nitrogen fertilizer in the seed bed, even all of it if it gets late into the first week in April. Total nitrogen advice, it should be in and around the 100 unit mark, slightly less if it's following break crops such as fodder wheat or a grazed cover crop, but in my experience 100 units, give or take 4 or 5, is probably the best, most consistent advice. Some years you may get away with more, but I think this year, given the importance of distilling barley, it is better to err on the safe side.
Okay, Max, thanks very much. I'll put my video on there now. Max, thanks very much for that, and very welcome back to the panel. We have Eoin Lyons joining us again. We have Kieran Hickey, Teagasc advisor in Wexford, Stephen Kildea from Oak Park, Max Potterton, thanks for your video, and Tom Bryan as well. So Tom, we didn't quite get around to you last time round. There was a lot of technical questions coming there, so I'm going to throw the first one to you. In terms of protein, Max mentioned that there was, in terms of distilling, the max protein content is 9.7. Can growers deliver everything up as far as 9.7, and does that include winter and spring barley?
Okay, thanks, Michael. In relation to winter barley, the winter barley is purely for brewing purposes. We have no variety yet identified that is suitable for distilling. There are trials ongoing, as you know, with the variety vessel, which is 0GN. So hopefully for harvest 2022, after we get the trial done in 21 harvest, we will have or be able to offer a variety for the autumn of this year going forward. In relation to the brewing distilling barley, we will attempt to purchase all the barley that we can for distilling to fulfill the quantity that's required. There is a slight overlap because we can take brewing barley from 8 protein upwards. So obviously there's a balancing act that will need to be performed in the harvest, and I can't predict at this moment in time whether we're going to have a low protein harvest or a high protein harvest or a medium protein harvest. Although with the weather conditions and the rain that's falling outside the window at the moment, I would think that we're probably looking at a medium, probably post March 17th, beginning to our sowings, which would indicate a sort of a moderate protein year. So we will take as much as possible, but it really depends on how the barley is coming in. But we have both brewing and distilling contracts to fill.
Okay, and just along those same lines, and there's a number of questions in around this, Tom. What are the market prospects like for 2021, and how is that going to affect contracts in terms of cuts and so forth?
Yeah, surprisingly good, given that we are now almost 1 year in since the original lockdown, and most of the wet pubs, whatever that is, haven't opened in the meantime, so they haven't traded. and there's been sporadic trading in the other public houses or hotels and establishments. So considering the environment that we're trying to work in, the reduction on the total contract that we require isn't large. It's in the order of about 15%, and it will really depend on as the time goes by and how quickly the government allows us back out, and the situation changes with COVID. That percentage might reduce a little bit. So it's quite low, but the brunt of it, as Max has pointed out, is in the brewing sector. So we would have no reduction whatsoever on our distilling volumes, only on the brewing volumes.
Okay, thank you. Eoin, I just want to come to you for a second. You mentioned about the soil analysis that's available. Some of the soil tests are available there. What, from the analysis that are taken so far, what's the general view, I suppose, or general results coming back from malt and barley farms?
Yeah, so look, the majority of the soils would have been taken from the southeast region and up towards Laois and Kildare, and really it's region specific in relation to results that are coming back. But generally, look, if you take Wexford, firstly, you're kind of seeing that K levels are fairly okay, along with pH levels, but that P level is still low, and it's hard to build on the Clonroe series soils to build that P up. So look, we are kind of moving towards trying to get more P into the seabed at sown time in order to try and increase them indexes. And as you come up further up the region into Carlow, Laois, Kildare type area, I suppose it's high pH, high P soils, and that causes its own difficulty with P lockup, and K levels maybe slightly lower than where they like to be. So probably a build up for K in that region. Okay, thanks, Eoin. Kieran, I just want to come to you for a second. Do you have a comment on there's a question here about any info on head yields of tillers versus the main stems, thick versus thin crops?
Look, we need to hit 25,000 grains per meter square to optimize yield. So generally, and Tom has mentioned this before as well about this homogeneous malt to have all the grains very similar. So obviously the smaller tillers, and we saw a lot of this last year where in some crops you actually had a lot of main stems and a second crop developed due to drought conditions in underneath. Now, I was expecting to have huge problems with protein, and there was a lot of green grains, there was a lot of small grains, but when the grain started to go in and everybody watched in anticipation, but there seemed to be very, very little difference in protein content, which was brilliant because it was a big worry. So I'd say, look, what we'd like to do is try and hit that homogeneous grain. I couldn't emphasize enough what Eoin said about the seed bed, the seed rate, getting the crop off to a fast start, getting seed, ideally on these Clonroe series type soils, getting fertilizer into the seed bed. We're on a P fixing soil down here. Eoin mentioned the soil samples there. One thing that we found with the survey was a lot of the samples are coming back low in P. Our soil mineralogy, we have a lot of aluminium in it, which locks up our P. So lime, which is something that we don't really hear enough about, particularly calcium lime in this area as well, helps to free up our P, which gives the crop a quick boost. And it's like what Max was saying there. If you can get this crop away as quick as possible, you're going to have better tillers, you're going to have a more even crop. And that's what we'd really like to see, is more grains that are the same. Yes, smaller grains do yield, but I think for where you're in a processing business, the more grain that you can have homogeneous, and there was a study done on this a number of years ago in Teagasc, and homogeneous grain generally gives a better result.
Okay, thanks very much, Kieran. Max, I'll just come to you just for a second. There's a question there around spring barley varieties, and it's showing on the variety lists they're over 11% protein and not within spec, but I presume we're talking about this dry matter. And the question is there work ongoing to find lower protein varieties?
Well, I suppose, Michael, the high proteins are largely a function of the sites where the variety trials would have been grown, and a lot of them would have been badly affected by drought. So it's a very large seasonal effect there that you're looking at. Most of those varieties are, in better growing conditions, the proteins could be 3 or 4% lower, so but in direct answer to the question, I suppose there isn't any specific research on varieties for lower protein, more just better malting quality, which is usually associated with more consistent grain protein in varieties. So they are related, but specifically on protein, no, I wouldn't think so.
And of course, the department have a variety list for spring malting barley variety trial, if you like, specifically aimed at that to look at the quality aspects you were talking about there.
Yeah, exactly. They're grown on 2 different sites as well under slightly different management practices, I suppose. But this year, yeah, they would have been still badly affected by the very dry April, May, and early June period.
Okay. Stephen Kildea, I'm going to come to you now for a program, for a question. There's a question here about the fungicide program on malt and barley trial that was carried out in 2020. Is that going to be carried out again in 2021? And was the high stress disease pressure, was it due to a year effect, or what was it due to?
So that's the program trial that Deirdre described. It is, we carried it out in 2020, but look, as the year that was in it, a very stressful year, I should also note. We didn't get Ramularia because it's not just the stresses per se, it's also then going to be the weather relationship and the rainfall, etc. It is something that we are going to carry out again in 2021. And I suppose we'll be looking, maybe we'll have the same number of treatments, and we'll probably include an additional sort of multi-site or combinations there to see if there's anything else we can look at.
Okay, Stephen, just to follow up on that, it's around stress as well. Number of questions in there about biostimulants, whether it's seaweed based or other types, and have they a role to play in reducing the stress in crops?
I'm going to give the honest answer and say that I can't say specifically if they will or won't. What I would say is that the indication, like we can look at the seasons that have gone back, and we can look at data from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And in any given year, the stresses there will be different, and a huge relationship will be with weather. And the 18 is the clear year that stands out in that if we were to look at the risk assessments in 2018 up until probably, I think, the middle of May, we would have said it was going to be a massive year for Ramularia, and the weather changed. And that was the biggest driving factor. Now, again, we had huge stresses in those crops early on because there was a lot of rain in March into April, etc. So it's not just as clear cut as saying that it's all about the stress. It's about, as Deirdre says, the interaction with all those things. And clearly, whether a biostimulant is going to be able to combine all those interactions, I can't give that answer. I would say that we try to manage as much of these stresses as is feasibly possible. Rain, we won't be able to manage, or lack of, I should say.
A complex issue, Stephen.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Eoin, I'm just going to come back across to you for a second, just in terms of catch crops and kind of back to that again. Question here, is there any best catch crop mix to use in a malt and barley situation?
I think the standard glass mix, the fodder rape and leafy turnip is probably the best as regards a malt and barley situation. Just like if you take an example, say, of a crop like mustard or something like that that's going to grow very tall and very stemmy over the winter period, probably won't be ideal for trying to incorporate back into soil the following year. And maybe a crop that's going to fix nitrogen is not going to be good for malt and barley either. So the standard glass mix of that double turnip is probably the best way to go, I think.
Okay. Kieran, I'm just going to bounce this one across to you, and it's kind of around cover crops as well. Is there any research in terms of P and K, or where does the P and K level go, or does it need to be adjusted if you're growing cover crops on ground?
In our area here, we see very little, apart from what Mark Boland was saying through the catchments thing there, we see very little effect in nutrient status or it being built up by continuous use of catch crops. They're very effective at catching the nitrogen on these Clonroach series type soil, but where people, I suppose, it comes back to what's shown in the video as well. The big benefit I see from the catch crops is more in the soil structure rather than the soil fertility. There's definitely, people would say when they're ploughing fields that have had good catch crops in them, they're an awful lot freer. They seem to break up an awful lot better. the structure is an awful lot better. But as regards fertility, I think the soil samples that we're seeing back in the program over the 3 years, they haven't really, the only ones where I see a massive difference is where people have used organic manures in their rotation, which is not really great for keeping protein levels down. But some of these people would have autumn cereals in their rotations, and use of organic manures will lift the fertility. The second one is, if you want to release nutrients and have a real effect, is the use of lime. And I can't say it enough. And it's been a real challenge in this area the last couple of years because the weather is not helping. And it's a catch-22. You're trying to get the crop into the ground as quickly as possible, but you have the challenge of trying to get lime applications out. And on this type of soil, we're looking at an application of 5 tonnes to the hectare, 2 tonnes to the acre of calcium lime every 3 to 4 years. And in the last 3 to 4 years, that has been very difficult. So I would say definitely catch crops are a huge help. I would say more so in soil structure and also the workability of the land and also moisture retention as well. The soils seem to be an awful lot healthier where those kind of mixes are going in.
I suppose around the P and K, they'll probably be recycled back around from the crop back into the next crop again.
But I think it's very slow, and for an immediate follow on, it's very hard to see it. And we're definitely not picking it up in the soil samples.
Okay. Look, time is pretty much against us. There's a good few questions there that we have answered. There's still a few more to go. We're probably not going to get around to them all. But Tom, I'm kind of going to leave the last word to you before we kind of finish up. A couple of questions in here around the ratio of brewing and distilling barley that you're going to be taking in this year.
Okay, Michael, thanks. Yeah, well, as Max mentioned in his video, we've performed an analysis of the last 5 harvests. And actually, we've extended that out for a couple of more harvests as well. So in relation to how we distribute the actual contract tonnage, so it isn't a ratio, it's a tonnage of distilling and a tonnage of brewing. It will be based on past performance to an extent. So there isn't an actual ratio. So some areas have a tendency to produce more distilling than brewing and vice versa the other way. So it's down to each individual contract will be tailored to match the suitability of each grower based on the 9.7 protein. We must remember that, not 9.3 like it used to be. So it's one that I can and cannot answer. The answer is that it's tailored to each grower.
A little bit fluid then, so okay.
A little bit fluid, yes.
Okay, Tom, thanks very much. And thanks very much to everybody today for your contributions, certainly from the contributions from around the country, but also to the panel here in front of me, to Richie, Eoin, Kieran, Stephen, Deirdre, Max, and Tom as well. And we also have Dara Whelan and Shay Phelan in the background who are helping to run this webinar successfully, and we're trying to answer a number of questions in the background. But certainly thanks to you, the participants, people who dialed in today, and certainly for your participation in terms of answering questions. It's been great to get them in, and it's some brilliant questions along the way. So over the next couple of hours, we're going to send you out a very short survey through your email just to get some feedback around the webinar today and how we can improve for the future. So you might spend 3 or 4 minutes filling up that. That's all it should take, and your feedback certainly will be appreciated. So this is the final webinar of 6 webinars we've had over the last month in Teagasc, in the Teagasc Tillage Month. So we've had a huge level of participation from farmers, from the industry, and unfortunately, doesn't look like we're going to be meeting face to face for some time to come yet. So we're going to continue with these webinars over the next number of months ahead. So the next series, I suppose, that we're going to start with, it actually starts next week. It's a series of crop agronomy webinars. So it's starting on March 2nd, so today week at 11:30 a.m., same time again. And we're going to run these every month over the coming months, again with a similar format, looking at crops all around the country. So look, with that, I'm going to say thanks very much to everyone again. Let's hope the weather is going to start to turn a little bit for the better. And we hope to see you next week for the crop agronomy webinar. In the meantime, all the best, stay safe, and goodbye from everybody here.